West Virginia state prisons and jails are in crisis. They're overcapacity and understaffed. In August of 2022, the shortage of correctional officers was so critical that Governor Jim Justice had to deploy National Guard troops to help staff the facilities. Compounding the issue, West Virginia's jails are overpopulated. Just over 51% of those incarcerated are held in what's called pretrial detention because they can't make their bail. In 2022, West Virginia County spent more than $45 million to warehouse these individuals, who aren't necessarily dangerous. Most are incarcerated awaiting trial because they're poor. And a disproportionate number are Black. I'm Trey Kay, and from West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, you're listening to Us and Them, the show that tells stories about the things that divide us. There are about 1.9 million people incarcerated in the United States. That includes federal and state prisons, local jails, and detention centers. In fact, the U.S. incarcerates more people per capita than any other country. America also incarcerates more Black people as a percentage of its total population. Just over 13.5% of the nation's population is Black, but 38% of the nation's incarcerated population is Black. And I want to say from the outset, for this episode, we're looking at West Virginia state prisons and jails, not federal facilities. The U.S. Census Bureau reports West Virginia's population is 93% white, one of the highest rates in the country, while West Virginia's Black population is 3.7%. Black people make up 12% of the state's incarcerated population. What contributes to that racial disparity? Why are people of color overrepresented at every level of the criminal justice system? Are there more complex social and economic factors at play here? To answer these questions, we headed further upstream to examine how someone enters West Virginia's criminal justice system. That can be as straightforward as getting pulled over for a driving violation or drug possession. But what happens next can vary wildly, depending on a person's circumstances. Since an arraignment is the gateway to any West Virginia jail, I decided to take a field trip for a courtside seat.
Somebody's present in day court every day from 8 a.m. until midnight for individuals who find themselves needing help with the court system or individuals who have found themselves under arrest who come in for their initial appearance.
So how many people come through day court in a 24-hour period?
Oh my, several hundred.
Kanawha County Magistrate Tracy Strickland explains this first point of contact with the criminal justice system.
They can come to day court to request a domestic violence petition, a personal safety order for people who are under arrest. They come in to post bonds. They come in with tickets. They come in for a variety of things.
Magistrate Brent Hall presides over this session of day court.
How are you today? You've got a couple things going on today. You're here for a warrant for driving suspended, third offense, DUI.
A lot of this may seem familiar if you've watched a show like Law & Order.
You are not required to make any statements today, and any statements you do make can be used against you.
After a person is arrested, their first appearance is an arraignment. A judge explains the charges and the possible penalties.
The possible penalties today for these charges are up to 3 years in jail and up to a $5,000 fine for each charge.
And although arraignments are a matter of public record, and those accused face charges, they have not been found guilty of a crime. And because of that, we're not naming any of the people in court today.
So today, each one would be 3 years. You're being charged twice, so it's up to 6 years in jail and a $10,000 fine for these charges.
But this arraignment also represents an inflection point, how the court will handle a case. It's a magistrate who decides whether a person will wait for their trial out on bail from home or from a jail cell.
Now, you are allowed to have an attorney represent you during every stage of this proceeding. If you cannot afford an attorney will be appointed to represent you. Do you understand that?
Yes, Your Honor.
That's an important point. Magistrate Hall reminds the accused he can have an attorney represent him at every stage of this proceeding. And that includes this arraignment. I asked my guide, Magistrate Strickland, about this.
You know, when somebody is first under arrest, if they are able to make that initial phone call because they know somebody to come and be with them at their initial appearance, they can absolutely do that. But most of the time, Joe Smith off the street doesn't have access to an attorney to call and say, hey, I need your help. I'm going to magistrate court. You know, so that's where it's important for us as magistrates to make sure that we are as specific as possible explaining what they've been charged with, what the possible penalties are.
Then Magistrate Hall asks if the accused wants to hire an attorney or have one appointed or represent himself.
One appointed.
At this time, I'm going to ask you to initial C that you would like a court-appointed attorney and sign the bond.
That's what I say.
This time, I'm going to ask you about your finances to see if you qualify for a court-appointed attorney. You have a job.
Yeah.
What do you do for a living?
I'm a contractor.
Okay, what do you make a month?
It really varies. I mean, it can be anywhere from 2 to 3. Yeah.
We'll put down $2,000 a month. Do you have any other source of income? Do you get food stamps, disability?
No, sir.
Any other kind of assistance or jobs? Okay, do you own an automobile?
No, I don't own one.
Do you have any cash on you, checking accounts, any cash?
No, I left my wallet in the car.
Do you pay rent or mortgage?
I own home.
You own a home? How much is your home worth?
I'd say probably maybe 75, 80,000, somewhere around in there, maybe. Maybe.
Okay, and do you pay utilities at your home?
This interrogation over the man's finances will determine whether he qualifies for a public
Now,
defender.
do you have any children you support that live with you?
No, I pay child support.
And how much do you pay in child support?
Meanwhile, there's a check in the county's database for any criminal history or missed court appearances, which help determine the bail amount.
I'm going to be setting your bond today at $500 cash only. At trial, you have the right to plead guilty, not guilty, or no contest. If you want a jury, you'll have to ask for it no later than 20 days in writing, okay? Put your signature right there for me, sir.
Well, I'll be able to have my peoples come up here and bail me out, like anytime, like right now. I mean,
We'll see about those arrangements. From here, you'll go to South Central Regional Jail, and if you want to be bailed out, we'll be glad to bail you out as soon as someone comes up here. And we are open till 12 o'clock this evening.
they have to come in here though?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Is there any other questions?
That's it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
South Central Regional Jail is just one of 25 adult correctional facilities in West Virginia. Currently, it's operating at more than 110% of its designed capacity.
Now, a lot of people would ask me, why did I set that bond, or how did I set that gentleman's bond?
To be a magistrate in West Virginia, you need two things: a high school diploma, and you need to get elected. Brent Hall has been a magistrate for 11 years.
And it's whether the person's going to reoffend, whether the person's crime is a dangerous crime, propensity to commit a crime, the seriousness of the crime, and the community ties. The whole idea is to make sure that they come back to court. So someone from Detroit is going to get a much higher bond than someone who is, per se, employed here in Charleston, West Virginia, and owns a home here in Charleston, West Virginia, that we can find easily. So in this case, he's already missed one court date, and he continues to do the same crime, and he's not coming to court. It's a driving offense, so he's not necessarily dangerous, but he's not abiding by the court's orders. And I've decided to put a $500 to make sure his appearance is good.
At this point, the man who faces his third DUI will either come up with the $500 and get bailed out, or he'll stay in jail until his trial in 6 days. Magistrate Strickland explains how long people who cannot make bail have to sit in jail before their day in court.
If an individual is incarcerated with a bond that they cannot make out of the initial appearance, the hearing has to be set within 10 days. If an individual is in day court and they are able to make a bond and they are released, then the hearing can be held within 20 days. But if an individual is incarcerated, the hearing has to be held within 10 days.
Pretrial detention has been called the front door of mass incarceration.
Sarah Whitaker has spent 9 years as a public defender in Kanawha County.
People who are jailed while they're awaiting trial are more likely to be convicted, more likely to receive a jail or prison sentence upon conviction, and more likely to receive a longer sentence than those who are not detained prior to trial. In West Virginia, like in most places, whether you're jailed prior to your trial or not depends on how much money or wealth you have.
Whitaker is now a criminal legal policy analyst with the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy. She says bail options are some of the first points in the system where racial disparities can be on display.
It could be a cash bond, either the full amount of the bond or 10% of the bond. Or a magistrate can set a property bond, which requires first that a person owns property in West Virginia with a value of at least the bond amount, and second, that they pledge to forfeit that property if the bail conditions are violated.
Whitaker says when freedom depends on access to cash or property, Black West Virginians are disproportionately harmed.
The Center on Budget and Policy produced a report a few years ago that showed that Black households have $13,000 less every year in income than white West Virginians. The poverty rate for Black West Virginians is nearly twice as high as it is for white West Virginians. And home ownership, something that's really common amongst white West Virginians, 75% of white West Virginians own a home, is far less common for Black West Virginians. Only 47% of Black West Virginians own a home.
Just a few years ago, West Virginia legislators debated proposals to lessen the load on the state's overpopulated jails. In 2020, one of those proposals became law with bipartisan support in both chambers.
I think it was mainly intended to cut down on the amount of pretrial misdemeanors that would be warehoused in a county jail simply because they don't have money. But it didn't do that.
Delegate Mike Pushkin is a Democrat who represents a large section of Charleston with a district that's about 30% Black. He says the bill was intended to encourage magistrates to use more personal recognizance bonds. That's when the bail is set at zero, but a person has to promise to show up for their court date.
I supported it as it was first introduced. Unfortunately, as it made its way through the committee process, what they were able to get passed was a very watered-down version of the bill, which really, it made it optional. Leaves it up to the magistrate. It doesn't really set a real guideline as to when one would be released on personal recognizance and not just be warehoused in the regional jail until they can come up with the money. It doesn't really address that, and the numbers show it. It hasn't moved the needle one bit.
When you say it was watered down, I mean, were there certain lobby groups who had an opinion? And
mainly the bail bondsmen. They strongly opposed it. That's how they make a living, is on cash bond and floating people that money to get them out of jail. So they didn't want to see an increase in of people being released on personal recognizance.
But in addition to the lobbying efforts of the bail bondsmen, there was another vocal opponent to the idea of bail reform.
Crime, drugs, and addiction are as much a part of this place as the hills and hollers that comprise it. Addicts are not our target. We embrace and pray for their recovery, but drug dealers, you'll find no sympathy here. We've taken a tough stance on crime, very tough.
Back in February 2020, when the West Virginia legislature was debating a number of criminal justice reform bills, this radio ad was airing across the state.
But bail reform and other social justice initiatives threaten to reverse course. Revolving doors from arrest to the street only embolden criminal activity. There's only one way to kill a snake. You got to take the head completely off. We've wounded the snake. Now it's time to finish the job. This is no time to go soft on crime. We're winning. The bad guys are losing. I'm Mike Stewart, the United States Attorney for the Southern District of West Virginia, and I'll keep fighting for us to keep winning.
Mike Stewart was then a U.S. attorney who says he felt compelled to run what he calls public service announcements to criticize the bail reform measure.
Yeah, so I think my view may have been different today than it was at the time. But at the time, we had severe prison overcrowding, which we still have today. And these measures seem to be an effort to try to reduce our prison population. Well, the wrong way to do that, in my view, is to simply arrest people and put them right back on the streets. There's a role for incarceration. And so at the time, there was this discussion for cashless bail, things that I believe made our communities more dangerous, not more safe.
Today, Mike Stewart is a Republican state senator representing West Virginia's 7th District. It's a rural part of the state and about 96% white. He recently announced his candidacy for Attorney General. Stewart says he hasn't seen enough data on the bail reform's effectiveness, but he's wary of what he calls a revolving door approach to criminal justice.
My solution to prison overcrowding? Build another prison. If you've committed a crime that's worthy of incarceration, you should be serving your time. I believe in second chances and redemption. I believe you get there. We need to be more patient in terms of the way our criminal justice system works. Part of the criminal justice system is punishment. It's punishment. It's not all about rehabilitation. There's a proper role for rehabilitation, but punishment's part of the role too. The crime you committed, you're being punished for that crime. If you've committed a double murder, if you've done a terrorist act, if you've harmed some young child, I don't have a lot of compassion for you. The role of the prison system in making sure we lock up predators, folks who are dangerous to our society, I think there's a proper role for that.
You mentioned predators, murderers. You didn't say rapists, but let's throw those in there.
Sure.
Terrorists. I can imagine if somebody like that who's been alleged to have committed those crimes and they come in front of a magistrate, there's probably going to be a very steep bail or bond set.
We hope.
But I guess I'm wondering about people who are, it's a lesser crime. Maybe it's a misdemeanor. And it's someone who may be supporting a family. And the bail is set at, something that they can't meet. And that means that this breadwinner is unavailable to be a part of that family unit, unavailable to earn. And they haven't had their day in court yet. But there they are in a holding cell. What about that type of scenario?
So I am sympathetic to the person who commits a crime allegedly, right, innocent until proven guilty, but may not have the money to meet bail. If they're a nonviolent offender based on the totality of the circumstances and we provide them an opportunity because they're not a risk for fleeing or for leaving, there may be some validity to that. But if they're a violent criminal, they should be behind bars. This idea that you get arrested for whatever crime it happens to be, and I'm not necessarily talking about the worst of crimes, rape, murder, terrorism, assault on a child, or death of a child, but perhaps that burglary that may not end up in anybody being harmed. Listen, these are still serious crimes.
It seems to me that West Virginia, right now, the state struggles to pay for more prisons. and it struggles to pay for the staff to maintain the prisons. So can West Virginia afford to keep so many people behind bars, especially pre-trial detainees?
Listen, we should not be doing cost containment or saving money for taxpayers off the backs of putting dangerous criminals back on the streets in West Virginia. The idea that prison population ends up being a budget item where we try to manage the budget off the backs of how many folks are in. Listen, the number of people who need to be behind bars are going to be based off the number of crimes that are committed. And so I think it's a mistake if we try to equate saving money in our prisons by policies that let people out too quickly.
Legislative policies and legal machinations can seem quite remote from the lives of those who come face to face with the law. But for Kenny Matthews, West Virginia's legal system is familiar.
Yes, that's a good boy. I love you too.
He lives in Charleston with his wife and 2 dogs, but is originally from Chicago. Back in 2011, he was arrested on drug charges.
So basically, the amounts that I had, marijuana was about 1/4 pound of marijuana that I had. Most of it was for my own use because I also used marijuana at that time. And then the crack cocaine I sold, but the amount was like $20 worth of crack cocaine.
But it was enough cocaine so that he was charged with intent to distribute.
Well, I was arrested and sent to the regional jail. I was given a bond hearing. Before my first bond reduction, my bond was $275,000 cash only, and that's the type of bond you expect to have with somebody that has like a murder case or something like that, some really super heinous offense. And I had a drug offense, and I got a cash only bond in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Even when they gave me a bond reduction, they just dropped it to $150,000 cash or surety, which means I had to come up with $15,000 to get released. And obviously, I didn't have that money, and I'm sitting here for nonviolent offenses that, other people had, more violent offenses than I did, and they had lower bonds.
Unable to make bail, Matthews had pre-trial hearings and then waited for his trial in the Northern Central Regional Jail. So how long were you in pre-trial detention?
Before I was sentenced, I believe it was like 17 or 18 months.
Matthews was sentenced and released after serving 5 years and 3 months. In 2017, he was arrested again, this time for selling heroin with a street value of about $20. So in both instances, while you are both being arraigned and then you're going through your trial, did you make it clear and plain to the judge that you had a substance abuse disorder and that you were seeking treatment?
The first time, they do a pre-sentence investigation report. And in the pre-sentence investigation report, it says that I never violated parole or probation, that I had substance use issues, and that I told them that I wanted help and treatment for my issues. The second time I spoke to the judge at my sentencing, and he commended me for how well I spoke and the fact that, I put all my issues and problems out there, but still chose to incarcerate me.
Magistrates have sentencing options, including a drug diversion program often called drug court. It's an alternative track that requires offenders to go to drug treatment rather than prison. So I'm just curious, you're an African-American man. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that the court saw you any differently than maybe other people with similar circumstances with regard to substance use disorder?
I definitely believe so. I mean, just systemically, the disproportionate amount of African American males that are sentenced to prison versus their representation in the general population is like 4 or 5 times the amount as compared to other white citizens. And I think also the fact that I'm not originally from West Virginia. I'm originally from Chicago. So they looked at me as this out of town person coming down and quote unquote exploiting the problems in West Virginia for my own like financial gain. They didn't see me as somebody who transplanted to West Virginia and would continue to live in West Virginia that had issues themselves and got kind of wrapped up in all the issues that everybody was experiencing during those times and try to get me help and access to resources. And then if you think about the time frame, it was 2010 the first time, 2017 the second time. So during both of those time frames, it wasn't as widely, generally thought of get somebody help with a substance use disorder, especially when they had like charges of possession with intent or distribution. It was, they are a trafficker, so they need to go to prison.
Data suggests that Kenny Matthews' experience is not unique. The West Virginia American Civil Liberties Union submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the West Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals. The ACLU wanted the state's drug court demographics from as far back as 2006. Sarah Whitaker has been reviewing the data.
It's hard to say how people get referred to drug court, but we do have some statistics from 2021. We know from Supreme Court data that there were 576 people that were referred to adult drug courts that year. Only 348 were admitted, so about 60%. So starting off, that's not a large group of folks when you consider that there are 11,000 plus felonies being filed in a given year. Many people don't obviously get the chance to be referred to drug court. Discretion about who gets into drug court or who doesn't is going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But unfortunately, we don't have much of a sense as to how people get referred because those referrals really take place in the black box of prosecutors' discretion. I will tell you, when we look at people who do make it into drug court, only 3.3% of adult drug court participants are Black.
The Supreme Court data request also revealed that 36% of white applicants were denied, compared to 50% of Black applicants. Kenny Matthews, a Black man whose appeal for admission to drug court was denied, says racial disparity is inherent in the system.
Well, you can go to systemic racism because typically areas where minorities are at are over-policed a lot of times. You can go to where even sentencing, right, that more times than not, minorities, Blacks that are sentenced to prison time versus adjudicated with any other alternative sentencing options, whether it be home confinement, drug court, probation, or anything like that. So you're going to have that disparity in between population and prison representation. And it's shifting from being about race to being about poverty lines between the haves and the have-nots. But more minority African Americans are have-nots than there are that are part of the haves. So you're still going to have that racist, systemic injustice in those situations.
I don't believe in systemic racism. Am I saying there aren't racists? There absolutely are racists. But is there systemic racism in policing in America, that the system itself lends itself to racism? I'm not buying that.
State Senator Mike Stewart, a former U.S. attorney, rejects any suggestion of racism inherent in the criminal justice system. He says arrest statistics are clear and speak for themselves.
Listen, I'm a data-driven guy. I think it's important we look at data. And as I said before, I think it's important that when it comes to crime, that criminals are prosecuted. I don't care what color they happen to be or what gender they happen to be. If they commit a crime, they ought to do the time. But I don't think we upend a system off the basis of anecdotal evidence. We don't set healthcare policy that way. We don't set public policy that way. We shouldn't set criminal justice policy that way.
Using data to determine the state's criminal justice policy seems like a reasonable approach. But Sarah Whitaker explains that across West Virginia's 55 counties, data is hard to come by.
It is possible, but it's extraordinarily difficult, perhaps by design. West Virginia does not have publicly available case management systems for its magistrate and circuit courts. As a result, people who are interested in obtaining case-level data must go to the courthouses themselves to request individual case files. And remember, when we talk about the criminal system in West Virginia, we're talking about 55 different criminal systems, right? Each with their own magistrate court, each with their own circuit court. Magistrate court is where misdemeanor cases are heard. Circuit court is where felony cases are heard. But here's the thing, that's a lot of cases. In 2021, circuit courts where felony cases were heard had more than 11,000 case filings. Magistrate courts had more than 123,000 case filings. So that's an extraordinary amount of work to try to obtain case-level data from West Virginia's criminal system.
What do we lose if that's not accessible, researchable? Who is being harmed by having a state with 55 counties and 55 different magistrate systems or court systems?
We're all harmed by that.
Why?
Well, one of the things that it robs us of is information about which counties may be exacerbating these racial disparities, which prosecutors are using their discretion in ways that harms certain members of the community, which police departments are arresting more Black people than white residents.
Coming up, we'll hear how two very us and them guys work together on legislation designed to ease the burden on West Virginia's jails.
Folks who could be arrested for failing to appear with an outstanding warrant would be picked up and held, sometimes almost indefinitely.
For offenses that aren't even incarceration eligible in the first place.
You're listening to Us and Them. This program is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation. This episode is supported in part by the Just Trust.
In difficult times, music gives us peace, brings us together, and helps heal us. It calms our nerves and brightens our days. That's why we're bringing you classic episodes of Mountain Stage on air and in our podcast. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find something that's familiar or brand new and feel the power of live music on our website, mountainstage.org.
Hey, Trey here, and you're listening to Us and Them from West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX. West Virginia lawmakers continue to address the state's overpopulated and understaffed jails. The 2020 bond reform bill encourages magistrates to release lower-risk offenders on personal recognizance. A more recent law is House Bill 633. It deals with cases where a person fails to show up for a hearing or doesn't pay fines like child support. These cases end up with what's called a capias warrant.
And so capias we dealt with in the past legislative session. Perhaps it should have been dealt with a long time ago. Rather than cashless bail, maybe we should have dealt with capias, where in West Virginia we saw there was significant abuse.
Senator Mike Stewart supported the legislation.
Folks who could be arrested for failing to appear with an outstanding warrant would be picked up and held, sometimes almost indefinitely, because they failed to appear. And some of these folks didn't even know they were supposed to appear. But there was abuse there. There's no question that capias in West Virginia, missing your appearance, having a felony warrant out there and not showing up when you're supposed to show up, would get you arrested and you'd be held behind bars for a long period of time.
This legislation is now law, and we've already met one of the people who helped write it.
So here we are, West Virginia State Capitol.
Yeah.
So tell me, when did you first become a lobbyist?
Officially this year. Unofficially, I've been lobbying since I was released from prison.
That's Kenny Matthews. We spoke with him earlier in the episode.
And this year, I got offered the opportunity through the American Friends Service Committee to become a lobbyist on criminal justice, economic justice, and recovery-related issues. And so this past legislative session, I almost lived up here and just was talking to senators, delegates, other organizations that had lobbying efforts here at the Capitol, and we were able to get some good bills passed, some not so good bills killed, and also were able to add some amendments to some bad bills to make them better.
One of those bills was House Bill 633 on capias reform. Matthews worked with several legislators, including Senator Mike Stewart.
I'll tell you a bill that he was for and helped pass in the legislature was Senate Bill 633, capias reform, to get the people that are being held on capias, which is failure to appear in court, getting them a hearing, a timely hearing, timely bond, and the ability to have that capias removed. Because a lot of them are being held on capiases for offenses that aren't even incarceration eligible in the first place, or somebody was incarcerated. They didn't get transported to court because of lack of staff or transport order mix-up or something like that, and they get released and they have this capias, which is a warrant for your arrest, and they get arrested while they're doing well.
So you have several specific bills that you've come to know, and you certainly have your lived experience that you bring here. I guess I'm wondering, what is it like when you go to speak about these issues of these disparities in prison and what it is that we can do about the overrepresentation of black people in prison, if you're talking to somebody who comes from a county who, A, doesn't have many black people, and B, might have come here with an agenda of things that they want to accomplish, and what you're talking about is at the low part of that. That's at the bottom of the list, if it's even on the list.
Those communities that you're talking about are rural communities. The tie that binds the two together is poverty. So when I come up here and I talk to somebody, let's say from Greenbrier or Webster or Raleigh or Boone County or Lincoln County that doesn't have a huge population of African Americans in there, I say, this law is going to attack those that are in poverty. This law is going to attack those that don't have the means to hire an attorney to defend themselves, don't have the means to further their education. This is what this impact is going to be in your communities. And in kind of an intended consequence of that is that it helps my community, which has been inundated in poverty and over policing and all these different things.
Do you make sure to make that clear?
I think it's kind of obvious if I care about an issue and I'm talking to somebody, you don't have to always bring necessarily race into it.
But is that part of the problem in West Virginia, that in many ways we don't want to talk about race?
It's not that we don't talk about it. It's that it's not the thing that catalyzes every single problem. The poverty disparities do. When you have somebody who has grown up in poverty their entire life, regardless if they're white, black, Asian, Latino, they have a higher chance of incarceration. They have a higher chance of substance use. They have a higher chance of mental health. How do you combat those issues? Resources, support systems, education, programs, all these different things. And there are areas in this state that has maybe no black people in the area that send a high portion of their population to incarceration because they are poverty stricken.
But with regard to the fact that black people represent a high percentage of people who are behind bars, incarcerated. They represent 12% of those behind bars. As we're looking at that, is there anything you think that we're missing?
Where those 12% are coming from? What counties? What areas? What is their economic background? Because if we say that we got 3.6% black population in the state of West Virginia, and they make up roughly 12.4 to 12.9% of the incarcerated population, what counties are sentencing those people to incarceration? Is it from counties and areas where they have a higher African American population or a lower one?
Have you looked at that?
I haven't. And I'd be interested to see that data, because I think that would be telling of possible initiatives to change those numbers and see what's the level of incarceration, let's say, in Kanawha County for African Americans. How often are they likely to be arrested on charges?
Okay, let's say you get that data. Mm-hmm. What would you do with it?
Use it to initiate change on the county level, because the officers that are getting placed into the police force, the judges that are getting put into the judicial system, the county commission, the magistrates, all those things that play a part. There's certain things that the legislature can, address, right? But they aren't trying to address it for an entire state. They're not looking at the individual county level stuff, that local level issue.
The reasons for the racial disparities in West Virginia's incarceration rates are buried in data at the county level. The state's 55 counties determine which demographic statistics are collected and shared. That makes it nearly impossible to identify specific factors that can lead to incarceration. A number of people we talked with suggest it's not just black people in West Virginia who are more likely to be incarcerated, but poor people. We wondered about some of the specific indicators. For instance, in any given year, how many people qualify for a public defender? Eligibility varies according to the size of the household, but for an individual, the maximum annual income is just under $16,000. The counties don't keep track of how many people qualify for a public defender. However, an agency called Public Defender Services oversees all of the state's court-appointed attorneys. And they report that more than 90% of people who face incarcerable charges in West Virginia's courts qualify for a public defender. Another way to look at that, on average, only 1 in 10 people charged with a jailable crime in West Virginia makes more than $16,000 a year. That's the equivalent of a full-time job making $8 an hour. Although that statistic may seem surprising to you, some people say a person's economic circumstance is a factor in the likelihood they'll commit a crime. Senator Mike Stewart is among them.
I think forever, as long as we've had a criminal justice system, those folks who are poor, disadvantaged, probably serve in prisons at a higher rate than those who have been more successful, have more stable lives. I don't know that for a fact. I haven't studied these numbers, but I think it just makes sense.
But if that is true, if you haven't studied it, and I'm not presenting you with our data, but let's just assume that's true. Would you think that's problematic?
I don't know. I don't know. I'd have to see more than just the mere question. I think you probably would look at any prison in America and have a higher percentage of poorer folks on the income scale than wealthier folks. And why that is, it's going to be the nature, I think, of folks. Why do they commit crime? It'd be great to get folks not to commit crime, right? That's the ideal. But I think it's fair to say those folks who struggle, those folks who are trying to get by, those folks who on the lower income scales commit crime, I would expect on a higher percentage basis than in communities where they're more successful and have higher economic incomes and economic opportunity.
So, do the available arrest and sentencing data suggest that poor people commit more crime?
The biggest myth is that poor people do the most harm in our society. And I think there's no better example than what we saw unfold in the last 20 years of the opioid crisis here in West Virginia.
That's Sarah Whitaker, who we spoke with earlier. She's a former public defender and now a criminal legal policy analyst with the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy.
Let me give you an example. A lot of folks who are listening may think that the disparities that we're talking about in the criminal system simply reflect the crimes that are being committed. When our society talks about crime, we're actually, though, talking about a narrow set of behaviors. We're talking about some harms that are committed by some people. So, for instance, if you are accused of selling one opioid pill, like oxycodone, in West Virginia, you would face a felony charge with a potential sentence of 1 to 15 years. But what if you sold opioid pills, many opioid pills, through a pharmacy? Right? We don't think of that as being criminal, but consider what happened in Kermit, West Virginia, right? A tiny town in one of the poorest counties in the country. Over a 2-year period, out-of-state drug companies shipped 9 million opioid pills to Kermit. 9 million pills for a town of 392 people. And we know now it wasn't just Kermit. Over a 6-year period, drug companies sent 433 opioid pills for every man, woman, and child in West Virginia. How's that not criminal? This was a business strategy that killed people. For the last decade, West Virginia has had the highest fatal overdose rate in the country, more than twice the national average. McKesson was one of these drug companies that shipped all those pills to Kermit. And although there was a strong case against McKesson, it ended up with a $150 million civil fine, which might sound like a lot, but actually represents less than 0.1% of the company's annual revenue. No one from McKesson went to jail, not their CEO at the time, who instead retired after earning more than $750 million as their CEO.
Sarah Whitaker offers a stark reminder that our laws come from choices we make about what to call a crime. When we create a criminal charge and say that selling an opioid pill to one person is legal, but not to someone else, Whitaker says that's not just a legal choice. It's a policy choice that comes from our politics. And at its heart, we're not only deciding what a crime is, but also who is a criminal. You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this episode is me, Trey Kay, Mitch Hanley, and Kate Smith. Special thanks to Mary Beth Beller, Danielle Walker, Darren Lester, Lyda Shepard, Judge Mary Claire Akers, Rick Holliker, and the Kanawha County Magistrate Court. Michael Lipton, Tristam Lozow, and Ahmed Solomon wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the West Virginia Humanities Council, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation. This episode was supported in part by the Just Trust. Hey, we'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode. Would you share them with us on our Facebook page or on Twitter at @UsThemPodcast? Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.